Tonight we have the first module of several modules where we're going to look at waking up, as Ken Wilber called it. And then we will also have the cleaning up part, or the learning, healing, growing, and awakening. So tonight we focus on awakening. And in integral theory, when it comes to spirituality, we talk a lot about spiritual development. So there's not just like you're spiritual or you're not spiritual, but Ken Wilber talks of 5 different stages of development. And that's a little confusing. Why does he call it stages of spiritual development? The reason why he calls it stages is because spiritual state experiences are free. Everybody has had them in their life, or most people have had them, and they had different forms, different qualities to it. But Abraham Maslow called it a peak experience, other people call it an awakening experience or a oneness experience, or whatever it is. And often it hit us out of the blue. It just happens all of a sudden. We can't even really tell why. Or maybe we've been in a workshop or sat with a spiritual teacher, or we're in a certain context, or meditated, and we had this, for lack of a better word, spiritual experience. And then we drop back to our good old self, so to speak, and sometimes wonder, what happened? How can I feel that way, this freedom, right, this connectedness, this enlightenment that I felt? How can I go back there? And Ken spent pretty much all of his life to investigate himself and to practice how can we make these temporary state experiences permanently accessible. And the answer is through spiritual practice. Or sometimes it says enlightenment is an accident, but meditation makes you more enlightenment prone, right? It's more likely that you get enlightened. But we have our raisins tonight, and so we don't need all that crap. Not just joking. So there are 5 stages. And it's pretty abstract if he names them the gross realm, right? The physical realm of objects, the subtle realm of thoughts, and the causal realm of sort of like having certain experiences, and then the pure witness, which is the subject that cannot be made into an object, and then the non-dual. But for most people, this is just like very abstract. And the initial motivation for me to do this came from Eckhart Tolle, who writes in his book, The Power of Now, the ego cannot love. The ego always wants something. And so that begs, of course, a little bit the question, what is the ego, or what does he mean with the ego? Because so far we have talked a lot about healthy ego development, right? How can we grow up and become fully mature and be able to respond adequately to the challenges that we are faced in our relationships and in life, right? Through consciousness development, which sometimes is called healthy ego development. And now Eckhart Tolle says, well, the ego cannot love, it always wants something, and that doesn't make sense, right? So there are different definitions for ego, and what he means is our separate sense of self, our false sense of self. And so my story real quick around spirituality or spiritual practice actually started in 1988 when I started to have very severe panic attacks. And if you ever had panic attacks, they're not fun, right? They look kind of silly to other people because there's nothing wrong with you objectively, but subjectively you think you're dying, and you go into this your body goes into this total overdrive mode, in survival mode, and releases adrenaline, and you hyperventilate, and you can no longer digest, and it just screws you up pretty badly. And so I heard about something in Germany called Autogenetic Training from a psychiatrist named Schultz. I keep forgetting his first name. Maybe some of you know it. And he developed this method of sort of like a self-hypnosis where you lay down and you relax your body and you focus on your breathing and you recite certain things about my I'm calm and relaxed and I breathe normally and my heart beats regularly and things like that. And you just repeat this over and over in this relaxed state. And later I learned that was kind of like a form of meditation that I started to practice a few times a day. Whenever I went to this panic attack, I laid down if I could and practiced that. And then in 2000, I was introduced to Eckhart Tolle, as you know. And the guy who introduced me to him, he said, oh, my wife and I, we signed up for this retreat with Eckhart in 1.5 years. Do you want to come with us? We think you would really like that. And I said, well, what is a retreat? I never heard that term. What do people do there? And he said, well, they meditate a lot and they sit and then Eckhart talks. And I said, well, I don't know how to meditate. And I didn't want to feel stupid going there. So I had a co-worker. He went to a Buddhist Sangha in Sebastopol. That's Sebastopol, California, not Sebastopol, Russia, thank God. So I started to go to this Buddhist Sangha and learned more formal meditation, sitting cross-legged, and they showed me a video how to meditate. And I also learned a little bit about Buddhism. And one thing I learned there, or they taught us, was like the 3 poisons, they called it the 3 poisons of the mind that create suffering. And these 3 poisons they called desire, attachment, and hatred. Later I learned it's the third one is usually called, what do they call? Delusion, right? If you don't think right from a Buddhist perspective. So usually it's attachment, desire, and delusion. But they called it hatred for whatever reasons, or at least that's what I remember. And so I learned to meditate there and also work on looking at my desires and attachments and what I'm rejecting and what creates suffering. And so over time, my meditation evolved from this embodied autogenetic training to this kind of Buddhist meditation, sitting. And then I was introduced to Ken Wilber and learned about these multiple stages or phases of awakening or enlightenment or spiritual realization. And over time, this meditation that I want to introduce you to tonight emerged. And so when I facilitate a group, a relationship group or a workshop, we always start with this meditation, because I think I wear the right t-shirt. It says love is unconditional, but relationships are not. And for me, it's very important and I started my book, Integral Relationships, in a way with that, to first give sort of like this larger context of, if you want, ego transcending love, where we're not coming from desire and attachment and hatred or wanting something, but where we come from a more universal level of love when we interact with our partner. And then, of course, there's also the manifest part of the relationship, so we don't want to reduce it to the unmanifest part of the relationship, if you will. So the ego cannot love, it always wants something, and we suffer, according to my Buddhist teachers, because we have desires and we have attachments and we have hatred. So I want to show you something which is called the Wilber-Combs lattice or matrix. And it is very central to the integral relationship model, and also very central to Ken Wilber's whole integral model. And if you know about Ken Wilber's work, he has been very interested throughout his adult life about these, what he called spiritual state stages, which we see here across horizontally in this matrix or lattice. And so what we just explored together was first awakening to the gross realm or nature, right? As we started out with the raisin, to become the witness, becoming fully aware of of the resin, and then our body, our physical body, right? We're part of nature, our body. And when we awaken to this gross realm, we realize that we are the subject, the witness of our body. So by definition, we are not our body, and we also, if we awaken that objects do not define who we are, that would be the awakening to the gross level of consciousness. And about a year ago, before Corona, I was walking in Istanbul here, and I saw a woman, she wore very flashy clothes, so she caught my attention. And across her chest, she had a t-shirt on, and it says, "I am what I wear." And there was like a reminder for me how many people define their self-identity through objects. So I'm not sure if she believes in what it was saying there, but if she does, right, she would create at least a part of her identity through the clothes that she wears. And a lot of people create an identity out of the possessions they have, right? The watch they wear, or the jewelry, or the clothes, or the car they drive, or the home they have, and the money they have in the bank account. We can, quickly create some kind of attachment or identity out of physical things. And then, of course, the desires emerge. Oh, this person has this object, or this money, or this item, so I want to have it too. So it elevates my sense of self, or it's kind of like a strange thing if you think about it, right? That if we define or derive some self-identity from physical objects, inanimate, or even being associated with other human beings, name dropping. I know this person, I met this person. Oh, let me show you my picture with Barack Obama. Let me show you my picture of my beautiful girlfriend. So this is this first level of spiritual awakening, of disidentification. So that doesn't mean you no longer have possessions, right? And you can even enjoy them, but you diminish or drop this sense of desire and attachment, or even hatred, right? I no longer want this. I want to get rid of that. This is ugly. I don't want to be associated with this. That's the first level of awakening. And then the next level of awakening arises when you realize that you are not your mind. So if you go into Eckhart Tolle's website, there's this photo, big, and then it says, "You are not your mind." That's his core message. And this is what he teaches, is the awakening from the tyranny of the mind, as he experienced it when he was depressed and suffering. And he wrote, I think, in The Power of Now, said at one point that, this thought arose in him that he said, "I can no longer live with myself," right? I want to kill myself. And as he uttered that, "I can no longer live with myself," he realized that there is an I and a myself. And this I is not myself. And then he woke up the next morning and was liberated from the tyranny of the mind. And then he just sat on park benches for a while, being in bliss. At least this is how the story goes, or how he tells it. And it's probably true. Right? This is this subtle awakening from the mind. So there is no more need for being right or feeling bad that you don't know things. And there's just a lot of freedom and liberation there. Just as when you awaken from the gross and you can disidentify from your body, you're also free from any kind of attachment to your body. And then the next stage of awakening is what we experienced when we experience this vertical drop into this deep, peaceful, awakened stage, or state in this case probably, or if you can permanently access that into a state stage. And this is usually what people then describe as enlightenment or awakening. But somebody said, and in here it says formless, right? It has no longer a form. It just has sort of like a causal feeling to it, maybe, or energy to it. And somebody said, I really like this, there should be a conference for enlightened being, and everybody who goes is automatically disqualified. Because, when somebody says, well, I'm fully awake, or I am enlightened, and there are, people who say that. I have some friends, actually, who say that and write books about it, how they're enlightened. The problem with that, it's not a problem, but you could ask them, who is or what is the self that is enlightened, right? And then there's still a subject and an object. I am enlightened. So there is a witness that experiences the experience of enlightenment. And this is where it gets tricky, because when we then try to connect with this awareness that is aware of enlightenment, at least what we know so far, this witness cannot witness itself. The subject cannot be made into an object. Right? This is just the isness out of which everything arises. And physics now has a lot to say about that. But the Buddhists spotted that already a few thousand years ago. This what is called apparently Turiya. Ken is very familiar with all these different names, and so I'm not a real expert in that. But this is this witness stage, or stage. And then when you can maintain this, at least the causal or the witness consciousness, and again, when you become one with the witness, if you will, and you can maintain that, let's say you go into the love circle and you stand across from other people, and so that emptiness becomes form and form becomes emptiness. That's what we usually then refer to as non-dual, which is also not something that is, you cannot really make it into something, because non-dual embraces everything, so it's not separate from anything. And so these are the 5 stages. And what Ken Wilber did in his writings until 2006, when he released Integral Spirituality. So if you read any earlier Ken Wilber books, like A Brief Theory of Everything, or any other books of the 20 or so that he had written up to that point, Nomi probably knows the titles of all of them, being a librarian. But what he did in these books, like One Taste, etc., Grace and Grit, he always put these stages of spiritual awakening on top of the structure stages that we explored, the stages of consciousness up here. And then Professor Alan Combs, who's the professor of consciousness studies at the California Institute of Integral Studies, CIIS, he pointed out to Ken that if these spiritual stages could only arise up here, above the transpersonal, then let's say a Buddha or a Jesus who lived in a mythic society, right? There was no rational or pluralistic or integral when they lived, or a shaman, as some people say, who lived most likely traditionally in a magical tribe, right? They could not have had any of these spiritual realizations. And so he convinced Ken that the spiritual development or these spiritual experiences can appear at any level of vertical consciousness development and are then interpreted from that particular level. And just to reiterate, right, states are free. So you probably in your life have experienced, a gross state of disidentification and freedom, a subtle stage of disidentification and freedom, a causal state of disidentification and freedom, and a witness stage of disidentification and freedom, and the non-dual. It's a little difficult to talk about, but it sort of like integrates all the other four stages. And through this meditation and practice, you can make these states, these temporary states that arise, usually without a cause, you can enter them at will. You can activate them and make them accessible, or access them as a stage. And so this is important from a relational perspective, because some people want to be with a partner who is spiritual. And sometimes women say, I want to be with a man who has transcended his ego, right? Which is kind of a bit funny, but we know, at least we have a pointer of maybe what she means. And what we see here then is that spiritual is not a black and white thing. It's not like you're spiritual or you're not spiritual, but it would beg the question, what do you mean by spirituality? And I have a few different definitions of what being spiritual means to begin with. Some people just means to be in touch with your feelings, for example. But in this sense, we would then could investigate what level of spirituality is she expecting from a partner, which is probably the same level that she has attained or maybe experienced in the past or wants to experience. So we can have a conversation of what does that really mean? Right? What are you still attached to? What are you still desiring? What are you still identified with? And maybe want to practice to disidentify with. The other thing is that I noticed that over and over that people conflate sort of like spiritual development with ego or consciousness development. And what we see here is that somebody, let's say on a magic level, can be very highly spiritually developed, but still be very narcissistic and be very superstitious and have all kinds of like magical beliefs that are not grounded in any kind of reality, right? And maybe they may argue then and say, well, there is no reality. What do you mean grounded in reality, right? Money is just energy, and you can do all kinds of like magical things, like do all kinds of healing or whatever it may be. Or an egocentric person who has some level of spiritual realization, they may just feel like that they're the only enlightened person in the world and that other people should worship them. And maybe they also become very abusive, right? They may say, well, when I cheated on you, or when I stole your money, or when I abused you, right? And that's just like if you're fully present and if you're awakened, it wouldn't bother you. So you can do everything you like. Nothing matters, right? Some spiritual teachers say nothing matters because everything is just as it is. It all arises in the moment, and there is no moral considerations, no ethical considerations. And since I'm the enlightened one, I'm above you, and so I can tell you what to do. And if you have any resistance, that comes from your ego. So if I tell you to stay into cold water for 5 hours in the freezing night, and you have a problem with that, that's your ego, right? Or if I yell at you, or if I ask you to give me all your money, that's all your ego. And that comes basically from a very egocentric perspective of the teacher itself, the guru, even if he's verifiably enlightened. A mythic person usually starts some form of religion, with some groups where you're in or out, and there is usually a lot of ritual, as we know from all traditional religions. So when I read The Power of Now and met Eckhart, and had like certain experiences just being in his presence and reading the book, there were no rules in a way. Of course, you could not punch him in the face or something, but he never said you have to practice this, or you have to follow this ritual, or you have to become a member of this group, or we call this something, right? There's none of that. It's just like he's just there and speaks, and take it or leave it, and that's it. At least this is how it was 20 years ago. And then I joined this Buddhist temple, and all of a sudden there were all these rules. I had to take off my shoes. I had to prostrate myself in front of the Lama. I had to sit in a particular spot in the hall because I hadn't taken refuge yet. So I could not, and I could only participate in some of their services, and I could not put the scripture on the floor. It had to be put on a little bench, and right, and I had to pay $10. And there were just all these rules, and there was a hierarchy, and that I found it kind of fascinating because I had never experienced anything like that. But I also went like, why do they do all this stuff, right? Why can't they just read the power of now and be present and be joyful, right? Why do they need all this stuff around it? And that, of course, has some kind of purpose. I don't want to poo-poo that. And I enjoyed it for 2 years until I joined the Center for Spiritual Living, which had, some kind of little bit more of a rational approach, actually. They called it science of mind, right? So there's the word science and there's the word mind. And it was like a form of mindfulness created by Ernest Holmes, but of course there was also some magical thinking in it. But rational people typically are then interested in what happens in the brain. And we know a lot now through Daniel Siegel and other people, neuroscientists. And I just shared a link with someone that I can share later from Newsweek magazine, and another link about fear modulation, how meditation and mindfulness practice and yoga, contemplative prayer physically changes our brain, that leads overall to more well-being, and has many aspects of health that I don't want to go into right now, but you can read about that, and maybe it inspires you to meditate more or to start meditating. And overall, we also become more loving. But there is no hocus pocus to it, right? It's not something esoteric, metaphysical, God, whatever. It's just brain. Our brain just changes, and we have these different experiences from a rational level. Pluralistic people who are skeptical about science, they say, well, no, you cannot reduce spiritual experience to the brain. That's way too simple, right? There is something else going on, and there's more of a connection of universal love, right? You embrace all living things, and you feel one with Gaia, with Earth, and ideas of unconditional love, non-judgmental, certain moral considerations, but also the rejection of hierarchy emerges at this pluralistic level. So there's a rejection of teachers, of gurus. Right? Maybe you feel even a little, oh, why is Martin telling us all that stuff? And does he feel he's more enlightened than we are? And what's going on here? Right? And so Thich Nhat Hanh said the next Buddha will be the Sangha, for example, which was like a invitation to think about, we don't really need enlightened teachers because we can all be teachers for each other, because we're already in a way enlightened. And this old mythic concept of the guru and the students and the hierarchies, we no longer need that. We're going to do away with that, as pluralistic wants to do away with all kinds of hierarchies. And then integral brings in hierarchies again, right? They say, okay, that's too extreme, right? There's still some people who are more awake than others. And there's also more aspects to spirituality than just the interior. We need to look at spirituality and practice through the context of culture. And how is our relationship to spirit or to God or to the teacher, right? It's not only interior, there's also a cultural dimension to it, and also there is a physical dimension to it and a truth dimension. So sometimes it's called the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, right, which would be the three jewels in Buddhism, which would be the Buddha, the interior, the Dharma, the upper right truth, the teachings of the Buddha, in the lower left, or of Buddhism, and the lower left would be the Sangha, the cultural and the context, and then you can add the lower right, so like the physical, the social environment in which your spiritual practice takes place. And so spirituality becomes framed in this context, and then finally the the transpersonal level is where these four dimensions kind of collapse. The lines between these four perspectives goes away, and spirituality is no longer something personal, as the term transpersonal implies, but it becomes something beyond the personal, something universal, we could say, or something cosmic, where it's no longer such an individual pursuit as it is up to the integral stage. It's still very much about the individual. So Thomas Hübel, for example, does all this collective unconscious work, for example. He focuses way more on the collective than on the individual, for example, which is more a transpersonal expression of spirituality, but it's not pluralistic, right? It's still differentiated. And so this is why this matrix for relationships is so helpful and important, because you can locate yourself here in an area and your partner in a certain area. And unfortunately, if you are more or less evolved, to use that word, or awake than your partner, that will not feel very satisfying. You will feel alone very often in your relationship. And it's also not satisfying for your partner, who maybe is on the path behind you, because he or she will often feel disconnected from you, or maybe that you're kind of arrogant or aloof, or it's kind of, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know why you're not happy with me, or I don't know why you have all these expectations or desires, or why you have a problem with me being so identified with my body or money or my thoughts or something, right? So you get the idea how this, not only the vertical differences create challenges in relationship, but also the level of consciousness, of spiritual awakening, and that we cannot automatically say that if somebody is spiritually awake at a certain level, that they're also consciously developed in their growing up part. So the growing up and the waking up are two completely separate things that interconnect, like you see here in the Wilbur-Combs matrix or lattice.